This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
In this podcast of the essay, Japan in 5 Lives, Christopher Harding paints a portrait of the Japanese through 5 historical figures. In episode 4, he unveils the imperial insider, Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote what's thought to be the world's first novel.
A highlight of my first stint living in Japan, as a student in the mid-noughties, was the chance to attend a reception at the British Embassy in Tokyo. I'd recently taken, and decisively failed, an online test to join the civil service. With little hope of one day being the UK's man in Japan, this might, I thought, be my only chance to see the inside of the impressive embassy building at No. 1 Ichiban-cho, one of the most upmarket addresses in a neighbourhood, Chiyodaku, that is synonymous with power in Japan. It was an evening full of rather dry protestations of partnership, but I was struck by the way that speakers frequently invoked the idea of the UK and Japan as mirror images of one another. 2 island nations located just off a great continental mass. Both known for a certain reserve in their national characters, and both enjoying the stability that comes with constitutional monarchy. The British Embassy, in fact, faces directly onto the moat that surrounds the extensive, secluded grounds of the Imperial Palace. Seclusion must occasionally have felt like imprisonment for the then Empress Michiko, who married into Japan's imperial family back in the late 1950s, and went on to suffer serious anxiety as life in that family took its toll. By the time of my embassy soiree, it had become the turn of Crown Princess Masako, like Michiko, a commoner by birth, to develop poor mental health and to attract the heavy media attention that must surely make it worse. We ought to include then, in this mirror image idea, the charging at various points of both royal families with trapping and immiserating incoming women. First Michiko and Diana, and then their daughters-in-law, Masako and Meghan. And yet these families themselves are subject to a kind of mutual entrapment with the societies they symbolise and serve. The entrapment of a whole people, or a significant proportion of the population at any rate, was on display in the coverage of Masako's wedding to Crown Prince Naruhito in June 1993. Held at a shrine within the grounds of the Imperial Palace, it featured Masako dressed in a traditional 12-layered kimono, weighing around 14 kilograms, its outermost layer fashioned from green and gold silk. Handmaidens had taken hours to get her ready, bathing her, oiling her hair, and then sweeping it backwards and upwards and pinning it in place on top with a golden comb. The Japanese press, alongside Japanese companies hoping for tie-ins and a Charles and Di-style sales boost, went into overdrive. Here was entrapment not just by an institution, but by the deeply compelling answers that its culture and its rituals provide to that old question, who are we? One of the great chroniclers of that answer is a woman who almost exactly 1,000 years before would have been amongst those preparing a princess for her big day. Murasaki Shikibu was born around 973 in the imperial capital, Kyoto, into a junior branch of a powerfully influential aristocratic family, the Fujiwara. As a child, she didn't so much receive an education as overhear one. Her brother was studying for a career in service to the imperial court, and that meant poring through Chinese classics of history and literature, alongside major Buddhist texts and Japanese works like the Chronicles of Japan. A popular study method was to read out loud, thus allowing a curious sister to listen in. Murasaki's father seems to have recognised, and much regretted, that his daughter, rather than his son, possessed the brains in the family. A government post was out of the question for her, but 2 lines of work were available to clever, well-born women in this era, and Murasaki tried both. The first was writing. While classical Chinese remained the preserve largely of men, serving as it did as the language of government, women pioneered the use of a syllabic system for writing Japanese, known as hiragana. They produced literary diaries and miscellanies, which held later generations of Japanese in thrall. Here was a society blessed both with an almost impossible level of sophistication in its poetry, pastimes, dress, and general comportment, and with female chroniclers capable of wringing every last delicious detail out of the personal foibles, fashion faux pas, and social missteps of those who inhabited it. Murasaki might never have put pen to paper had it not been for the premature death of her husband when she was in her late 20s. She later recalled being suddenly seized by the fear that her life from then on would be one of drab loneliness. I existed from day to day in listless fashion, taking note of the flowers, the birds in song, the way the skies change from season to season, the moon, the frost and snow, doing little more than registering the passage of time. The thought of my continuing loneliness was unbearable. It was around this time that Murasaki began writing what became one of Japan's literary masterpieces, and perhaps the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji. It tells the story of a man named Hikaru Genji, Shining Genji, from the richness and romance of his early years as the gallivanting son of an emperor, through a more mixed and contemplative existence in later life. It may have been early chapters of this work, passed by Murasaki to friends for comment, and then copied and circulated at court, that provided her an entry ticket into high society, or at least smoothed her path once she got there. Whatever the precise circumstances, in 1005 or 1006, Murasaki was called into service as a lady-in-waiting for the young Empress Shoshi. Murasaki gained employment, and Japan gained an incalculably influential chronicler and commentator on imperial and aristocratic life. One of the most striking sections of the diary that Murasaki kept of her time as a lady-in-waiting told of Empress Shoshi going into labour in the autumn of 1008. Were this taking place in an earlier era, we might know about it only from a few austere lines in some official record. A baby was safely delivered, or wasn't. The Empress survived, or didn't. Instead, thanks to Murasaki, we follow a struggling, anxious Shoshi, just 19 years old, as the world around her gears up for the most consequential of occasions. It's the night before the birth, and to Murasaki's ears, the murmur of a nearby stream appears to blend with the sound in the distance of Buddhist priests embarking on a vigil of sutra recitation. As dawn approaches, the tone of the chanting changes. The ritual of the 5 great mystic kings begins. The voice of each priest, as he tries to best his neighbour, can be heard near and far, solemn and awe-inspiring. Then, the ritual over, the Archbishop of the Kannon-in leads 20 acolytes in procession, from the east wing over to the main building to cast magic spells. As they cross the bridge, their thundering feet sound strange and unfamiliar. As Empress Shoshi is moved to a dais surrounded by curtains of pure ritual white, it begins to look as though all may not go well with her labour. The priestly presence around her becomes larger and more diverse. Everyone worthy of the name exorcist, writes Murasaki, has been called down from nearby mountain temples, their noisy spells adding to the volume and the tension in the room. There are yin-yang diviners here too, along with female shamans, each shielded by a screen as she calls out to her spiritual contacts. Courtiers crowd round, jostling for position outside the dais curtains. Some, Murasaki notes in disgust, even try to take a peek over the top of the curtains, at a panicked scene in which rice is being thrown to ward off evil spirits, and attendants hurry the Empress through Buddhist vows in case she dies. We lost all sense of shame being seen in such a state, our eyes swollen with weeping. We must have presented a sorry sight, rice falling on our heads like snow, and our clothes all crumpled and creased. At last, just as it seems that all is lost, a son is safely born. Murasaki captures the celebrations that follow, noting the exquisite detailing on the clothes of people who attend. One lady is wearing a train decorated with autumn grasses, butterflies and birds, she tells us, all sketched in glittering silver. Occupying a great deal of space in Murasaki's diary is Shoshi's father, the great Fujiwara patriarch Michinaga. Already in the early 1000s, Japan's imperial family were not really in control of their own affairs. Michinaga, the supreme political operator of his day, was pulling their strings. The birth of his grandson brought the summit of his ambitions within sight. He would be grandfather one day to an emperor. And yet, as Murasaki shows us, Michinaga didn't always have politics on his mind. One day in 1010, we find him approaching Murasaki and the empress, the latter with a portion of the tale of Genji in her hands. Michinaga begins to comment on the work before suddenly seizing a piece of paper being used to hold some plums and writing on it a short poem intended for Murasaki. She is known for her tartness, so I am sure that no one seeing her could pass without a taste. Murasaki replies that she is shocked, but Michinaga is not easily discouraged. That night there comes a tapping at Murasaki's door. She remains still and quiet, waiting for the sound to cease. Then, in the morning, she receives a new piece of poetry. How sad for him who stands the whole night long, knocking on your cedar door. Tap, 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 like the cry of the queener bird. Murasaki is unmoved and writes back. Sadder for her who had answered the queener's tap, for it was no innocent bird who stood there knocking on the door. To read an account like this of life at the imperial court is to be both awed by its sophistication and to feel at home there, thanks to the humanity that shines through. That, for me, is the magic of Murasaki. For many Japanese, inclined to trace much of their country's misery over recent centuries to unsolicited attention from the outside world, most of all the diplomatic advances of the modern West in the mid-19th century, Murasaki and her world represent Japan at its best, during a time when it was truly flourishing. Such has been Murasaki's inimitable contribution to the "Who are we?" question. One may think much or little of Japan's present generation of royals, but they offer a direct link, blood and culture both, to that era and to its arts and values. Who, though, really was Murasaki? She herself doubted that anyone around her really knew. Towards the end of her diary, we find a combined verdict on her times and on herself, which, but for some of the details, seems to cut a distance of more than 1,000 years down to nothing at all. Each one of us is quite different. Some are confident, open and forthcoming. Others are born pessimists, amused by nothing. I hesitate to do even those things I should be able to do quite freely, only too aware of my servants' prying eyes. How much more so at court, where I have many things I would like to say, but people would never understand. So all they see of me is a facade.
The essay Japan in 5 Lives was written and presented by Christopher Harding. The producer was Sheila Cook and the editor was Hugh Levinson.